Colonel Zilinsky in just a few minutes. We'll go ahead and get started with a few housekeeping rules. Just some reminders for everyone in our virtual audience today. Please mute yourself if you have not already. There will be a Q&A portion at the end of the event, and we'll have a chance to kind of collaborate there. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat box function at any time throughout today's presentation, and we will save those questions for the Q&A portion at the end. For your best viewing pleasure, go ahead and put it on speaker view until we get to the Q&A portion at the end, and you can see everyone again. It'll give you the best viewing options. And then lastly, just grab a cup of coffee, sit back and enjoy. We have a great presentation for you today, and thank you again for joining us. I'll start by introducing our president and CEO, Michael Carr of the USS Missouri Memorial Association. He will be formally introducing our guest speaker for the day.
Well, good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Thank you so much for joining us for our first Mojo event of 2022. I want to thank Jacqueline for her hard work in putting all of this together. Great turnout we have this morning, or whatever time it is for you, to hear about the Space Force. Like probably most of you, we've all heard of the Space Force, but we're not exactly sure why we have it or what it is supposed to do. So to get us all educated, we have today Colonel Anthony Zilinsky to educate us. Colonel Zilinsky executes Space Coordinating Authority on behalf of the Joint Force Air Component Commander to coordinate, integrate, and synchronize space capabilities and effects throughout the Indo-Pacific Theater of Operations. Prior to his current assignment, he served as Chief of Future Operations Division Joint Task Force Space Defense, located at Schriever Air Force Base, which I presume is now known as Schriever Space Force Base. So I'm very, very interested to hear what Colonel Zilinsky has to say. Colonel, you have a very interesting name, obviously these days, which probably others have noted besides me. But leaving that aside, I welcome you. And take it away, please.
All right. Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, Mike. And really thanks to the audience for taking the time to learn about Space Force. During the login, I got to see a couple of faces, so you're not all completely anonymous, which is good for me. Does sound like we have somebody that might need to mute, but I'll keep pressing. So I also wanted to say that, the Mighty Mo has paid it forward a bit with respect to the Guardians, and that we've had several of our Guardian promotion ceremonies on the fantail. So, it's good to pay back, and that's an amazing historical, just one of a kind ceremony venue that wouldn't be here without your members and your organization. And then also with respect to Hawaii, we're kind of far away from all the space community hubs, Colorado Springs, the California and Florida coasts, or Washington, D.C. So we're a pretty rare commodity out here, and I know lots of people have lots of questions. I've caught people staring at my blue threads and my Space Force badge and have lots of questions. So without further ado, got 13 slides to cover, and I want to get to your questions. So next slide, please. All right, the beginning. So December 2019, the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, a lot of times we know it as the military budget, was signed by the president, and that established and funded the Space Force. So we became a separate branch or service under the Department of the Air Force. And those who are familiar with the Navy, which I suspect are a few of you, realize that there's two services under the Department of the Navy. So similarly, we've got Department of the Air Force. I started seeing DAF, Department of the Air Force, as an acronym, and really what that means is it's both Space Force and Air Force. The highest ranking military member is, looks like we borrowed this from the Navy because that's the Chief of Space Operations. Kind of looks like CNO, but it's CSO, and that's General Raymond. And of course, we share a common secretary. The Secretary of the Air Force is our service secretary. And then, like any other service, our headquarters, our Space Force headquarters, are in the Pentagon, and we fall under the Department of Defense. We're part of the executive branch, going up to the top there, with the Commander-in-Chief as our ultimate boss. All right, next slide, please. All right, Mike touched on this a little bit, the why the Space Force, but first, people have to realize how space-based services from our satellites, which are a national investment, enhance our daily lives. So paying at the gas pump with your credit card, that's brought to you by a space service, because that transaction has to be time-stamped and in order to be an official transaction. So there's a small antenna that's beaming that transaction information to a satellite, and then it's getting logged and being put on the appropriate server. But of course, it's not just pay at the pump. It's also Wall Street transactions. So brought to you by Space Force and our space assets. Another example that most people are familiar with are GPS and satellite photos. Those are used for farming and even wildfire monitoring. My family, I'm out here in Hawaii, but my family's out in Colorado. They've had red flag warnings, and anything that can help spot forest fires early is near and dear to us out west. And of course, just the internet. You know, it's the cloud, but a lot of times part of that cloud is beaming data off of satellites. So it fuels our economy. The slide there talks about nearly $500 billion of our economy and growing. And then on the right side, you know, space enables modern warfare. That's how we navigate, we communicate with our forces around the globe, and also how, if we had to put bombs on target and minimize collateral damage. All right, next slide. Thanks. So when you have an economic and military advantage, no surprise that people want to develop ways to take that advantage away from you. So this slide shows a continuum of threats against our space-based services. And on the left side, it talks about kind of the reversible. And that consists of things like overpowering a signal that's going up to a satellite. So say if a remote news truck was broadcasting live, and somebody was able to overpower the signal going up to the satellite, you wouldn't be able to see that live broadcast. Also, you can also jam at the receiver end. So whatever is receiving that signal, you could overpower the signal there as well. But those are reversible, so you disrupt the satellite service. But then, you know, if you're not jamming or transmitting, then it's off. But you know, way on the far end, there is kind of the destructive, non-reversible effects, and that could be lasers, direct descent, anti-satellite missiles. We say DA-ASATs, an acronym, or even kind of the you know, the ability to just detonate a high altitude nuclear weapon that would take out our low Earth orbiting satellites. So, you know, those are all different ways. And of course, we're actually most vulnerable on the ground. So we rely on antennas on the ground and also cyber networks. And of course, those are ways to take away our space advantage as well. So we have to defend against all those threats. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this slide has a picture of General Raymond. He's so far the first and only Chief of Space Operations, or CSO. And, you know, he's basically saying our nation depends on space. Our competitors are developing and testing ways to attack our space assets. And Space Force, the reason we were developed is we must be prepared to deter, defend, and defeat these attacks. And you hear it, you know, we don't want to fight a war in space. We'd love to have space be a peaceful environment, but the reality, you know, as shown on the last slide, is our adversaries, and I'll call them out now, China and Russia in particular, are developing these threats. And most recently, and kind of a little bit of a surprise to the world that this was not acceptable behavior, was Russia launching a direct descent ASAT to and obliterated one of their own satellites and basically polluted space with thousands of pieces of debris. So we have to be prepared, just like any other military service, to defend in our space domain. All right, next slide, please. All right, I'm going to deviate from the slide. Of course, you can read it because it basically is explaining that we're like any other service. But I want to deviate because one of the things that confuses people, and it's pretty unprecedented, is we have both a Space Force, a military service, and we have U.S. Space Command, or SpaceCom. And U.S. Space Command is actually a warfighting combatant command. And that commander, he's an Army General James Dickinson, he's assigned an area of responsibility, or an AOR. So in this case, the AOR for SpaceCom is 100 kilometers above the Earth and above. So he's responsible for deterrence and warfighting in that domain. And SpaceCom, unlike Space Force, SpaceCom is a joint organization. So there's soldiers, sailors, and Marines that are all part of SpaceCom, but Space Force is all Guardians, one service. So Space Force presents its capabilities and its personnel, its forces, to various combatant commands, but no surprise, mostly presents to US SpaceCom. All right, next slide, please. All right, when Space Force was initially formed, it started out with space operators, both officer and enlisted space operators like myself, given the opportunity to volunteer to transfer over. So, you know, if we wanted to, it was all voluntary. So that if we wanted to, we could have stayed in the Air Force, but the Air Force wasn't going to have space operations, so we would have had to change career fields. And obviously, a lot of us elected to step into the historical new service and help shape the future. But shortly after we took care of the space operators, it's just one of the boxes down there in the bottom. We brought on board via selective competitive board selection process acquirers, engineers, cyber professionals, and intel folks, and also people that could code software to meet the needs of our service. And we're a small service, and the way we're able to get away with that is these are the only career fields we have. People who are familiar or served in other military services know that support career fields make up a lot of each military service, but not Space Force. Space Force is going to depend on the Air Force for support career fields such as security forces, medical, legal, and even personnelists, at least for the time being. So kind of tells you what Space Force is comprised of and what it's not, and why we will have continued dependencies on the Air Force in this case. All right, next slide, please. All right, this slide shows some of our accoutrements. I mentioned the distinctive blue name tapes and service tapes we wear on our utility uniform, like I have on now, but we have our own seal. We have our own logo, the Delta. We have our own flag, and what we're working on, we've kind of demoed our actual dress uniform, but right now both our dress uniform and our physical training gear, our PTs are being wear tested so that hopefully we get them right, which if people have served, we might have experienced times where maybe our uniform wasn't quite right out of the chute. So I'll be happy to wait and make sure they get it right. All right, next slide, please. All right. So like any other service, we in Space Force need to develop our own doctrine. And because we came from the Air Force, our doctrine has traditionally been, been kind of molded, shaped by our Air Force roots, kind of heavily influenced by air-mindedness. But what we need to do is clearly we need to develop space-mindedness so that we are able to take advantage of our domain, which is very different than air or maritime or land. Our service's first doctrine came out less than a year after we were established. So in June of 2000, we released our capstone document, which is first codified our doctrine. And I think one of the most important things in there was just our cornerstone responsibilities, which are shown on the slide. Preserve freedom of action in the space domain. So obviously out here in Indo-PACOM, preserving freedom of action in the maritime domain is very important. We see that in the Straits of Taiwan, and we make sure that we're able to have free and open Indo-Pacific, including air and sea operations, but also in space as well. We enable joint lethality and effectiveness. So again, modern warfare depends on space. So we make sure that we provide those services to our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And then lastly, as an independent service, we're charged with providing independent options. So for the most part, we say we fight in all or multi-domains, but we also might choose to respond in a domain of our choosing. So maybe something happens on the land or against our maritime forces, but we choose to respond in space, or as we've seen recently, in the economic domain via sanctions instead of military action. So independent options are very important to give to our national leadership. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this shows our organizational chart, starting at the top with Space Force headquarters, and as I said, that's in the Pentagon. So we kind of had to clear some space in the Pentagon, so that was no small feat in itself. Kind of had to move folks left and right and squeeze in between, and we've got some space in the Pentagon and starting to decorate up our own corridor. out there. We are led by, as I mentioned, CSO, 4-star general. His vice is also a 4-star general. And so General Raymond at the top, and his vice is General D.T. Thompson. And then our highest ranking enlisted member is called the Chief Master Sergeant of the Space Force, and that's Roger Toberman. He's an intel professional by trade, so that kind of helped open up and realize that space isn't just about operations. It's about intelligence, acquisitions and engineering, and cyber as well. And then below that, it shows kind of our 3-star billets that oversee kind of our human resources, our technology, our operations, and basically our kind of future capabilities and resourcing, kind of traditionally known as the 1 staff, the 3 staff, the 5, 8, and the 9 staff, if you're familiar with the kind of joint terms. All right, next slide, please. All right, this one shows our organizational echelons below the headquarters. So Space Force has field commands, and right now we have 3 of those. So Space Operations Command, or SPOC, that provides our mission-ready forces that we in turn present to combatant commanders. Space Systems Command is our acquisition field command. So everything about procuring and sustaining the systems that we operate. And then Space Training and Readiness Command, or STARCOM, that kind of has a lot under one hat, if you will. So they're responsible for education, training, test and evaluation, as well as our doctrine. And then on the right, it shows kind of how we flow down from the field commands. So from field commands, we go down to something unique in the Space Force, deltas that are led by an 06 colonel. And I think unique, but I could be wrong. The Delta commander is deltas are responsible for a global mission. So not just say I'm used to the Air Force, of course. So a wing that is basically responsible for numerous, maybe for one mission, but only at a particular base or facility. And then below the deltas are our tactical level or squadrons. So we borrowed that from the Air Force. And squadrons are typically led by either an 04 or 05. And you might notice that we're kind of streamlined with only 3 of those echelons. Other services have 4 or even 5 echelons of hierarchy, of command hierarchy. So we're a little more streamlined as far as that goes. All right, next slide, please. All right, so Mike introduced this a little bit in the beginning, Space Coordinating Authority. So what is that? So that is in joint publications, Coordinating Authority is the requirement to correspond to a commander with respect to a particular topic. So in this case, space, all things space in the Indo-Pacific, there's a requirement to coordinate with the Pacific Air Force's commander, General Wilsbach. Space Coordinating Authority, or SCA, is just one of his many hats, and he's not a space professional by trade. So he relies on me to be his advisor with respect to all things space. And basically, I put out a wide net to make sure that I stay aware of things, space-related activities in the Indo-Pacific or that could affect the Indo-Pacific, so that I keep he and ultimately Admiral Aquilino, commander of Indo-PACOM, Indo-Pacific Command, apprised of space, so that we can best leverage space for that deterrence and defending and defeating, if necessary, that I've mentioned earlier. One thing is, I got underlined in the title of the slide, how we're integrated into the Indo-Pacific region today. Having SCA under the commander of Pacific Air Force is kind of a legacy construct that doesn't take into account Space Force or Space Command establishment. So Space Force is moving out with establishing what they're calling service component commands. So there'll be one out here in the Indo-Pacific called, appropriately enough, U.S. Space Force's Indo-Pacific. And essentially we'll be moving out organizationally from within PACAF to be our own organization along the same lines as PACAF and PAC Fleet, but for Space Forces. And that is a work in progress. That's got our Department of Defense national leadership has their attention, and we see that going to a Pentagon tank session so that we can be completely ready and answer all the combatant commanders as well as the service chiefs questions that they have when we establish kind of new organizations like we're planning on doing. And then bottom right, that goes back to spring, summer of 20, when we started transferring the first Air Force members like myself into Space Force. So we had a ceremony out there along Pearl Harbor off Hickam, and we took an oath, and we were all volunteers. We knew this going in, but we also had a service obligation when we transferred over. One of the things I meant to talk about earlier, but I will on this slide. So the first was space operators transferring over from the Air Force to Space Force. Then we had those competitive selected boards for acquirers, engineers, cyber and intelligence professionals to come over from the Air Force. And after that, we've had the ability for inter-service transfers. So soldiers, sailors and Marines had an opportunity to compete for some positions in Space Force as well. And just this week, I heard that some of those members, a soldier that I've been tracking in this case, has received his orders to Space Force. So it took a little while. There's lots of special cases that come into play. Is somebody selected for promotion? You don't want them to lose the ability to promote just because they transferred over, for example. So that was taken into account. And then the other thing that's going on later on this year is entire units are coming over from other services into Space Force. So the Navy Space Operations Center at Point Mugu that operates previous constellations of Navy satellites is coming over, and it's going to be the 10th Special Operations Squadron under Space Force. Another one that's coming over is the Army's 53rd Signal Battalion and all its worldwide detachments. And that will be 53rd Space Operations Squadron, including a detachment out here on Oahu. So looking forward to having those folks join us, and it's been kind of great helping them out because they've had lots of questions as we go, and either being able to answer their questions or getting to the people that can answer those questions. So speaking of questions, Next slide. I did allow quite a bit of time for questions and answers, and I really hope that that's the bulk of it. So I apologize if I went a little quickly, but let's slow down and answer your questions now.
Thank you so much, Colonel Zilinsky. That was very interesting. We did have some questions that were submitted actually before the program even began. So I'll start with those and then move to our chat room to see others. So please keep those questions coming. We will get to everyone. The first question is, what exactly do you do as Director of Space Forces here in Hawaii?
Yeah, thanks. I kind of just said I advised, but I have a team of five personnel. We're part of Pacific Air Forces or PACAF staff right now. Of course, as I mentioned, that's going to change. But I take pride in saying that we basically take care of all the service components. So PACAF, PAC Fleet, MAR4 PAC, and SOC PAC, as well as USER PAC. So all the services. And what we do is kind of near-term planning. So if you're familiar with those staff functions, I consider us kind of a quasi J35 near-term planners. And what we do is we see what operations are going on, say in air or maritime, and we basically take space products and effects and make those operations more safe, effective, or lethal, like you saw on the slide, one of our cornerstone responsibilities. So as an example, if somebody is going to conduct operations at sea, they probably are relying on satellite communications. So we can provide space weather products. So if there's solar activity that affects the ionosphere, that affects signals propagating through the ionosphere, and maybe they want to know that their satellite communications are going to be degraded in advance. Likewise, we have GPS accuracy products. So if you're going to do a precision airdrop using GPS guided equipment, you might want to know if GPS is going to be kind of degraded in that time and in that location ahead of time. And then the one organic capability that we have tactical control over is the ability to monitor those satellite communications and be able to detect, characterize, and in many cases, geolocate sources of interference. And a lot of times, day to day, sometimes maybe people don't get their equipment settings right, or maybe there was a planning glitch, and we step on our own transmissions, and that's the source of interference. But obviously, if we're gonna fight, we would expect our satellite communications to be jammed, and it's great to have a capability that can find those sources of jamming. So that's a pretty long answer, but I think that tells you what we do. We really take care of all the other services and basically advise them, let them know what space products and effects could help them out.
Sounds great. Sounds like you guys play a big role in a little bit of everything. Another question, we have one of our guests who is a hometown resident of Florida. She's wondering what part of the Patrick Space Force base in Florida will play in the overall Space Force operations.
So, the Space Coast down there in Florida and the Central Coast in California are critical because that's where we do the majority of our launches from. So, down there at Patrick, we tend to put things into geosynchronous orbit. Geosynchronous orbit is a special orbit that's 22,200 miles above Earth. And what's important about that orbit is that where that position is, it's in lockstep with the Earth's rotation. So the satellites we put in geosynchronous orbit are in apparent hover over Earth. Of course, they're orbiting, 17,000 miles or more, but to us on Earth, they're in apparent hover. And, as an example, that's why you can have a little direct TV dish that's just pointing at a satellite, and you don't have to track the satellites like you would for satellites in any other orbit. So probably another long answer, but obviously Patrick is key because that's where we do the bulk of our launches from.
Great, thank you. Question from our chat room. How is Space Force embracing or utilizing the new technologies coming out of the billionaire space race, such as Elon Musk's Starlink system?
Yes, so you know, partnerships are definitely valued, and you know, I would have been a pessimist a few years back. There's been some historical tries at what we call proliferated LEO, or having thousands of satellites and kind of an internet in space, if you will. But you know, in this case, SpaceX with their Starlink constellation actually made it reality. And you know, in the contested domain that it is, you might have seen in the news, sometimes we refer to those geosynchronous satellites as big, fat, juicy targets because they're in apparent hover. Our adversaries know where they are. One of the good things about them is, you know, you only need 3 of them in geosynchronous orbit to cover the globe. But the bad thing is when one of them gets taken out by jamming or a missile, you lose a third of the globe coverage. So something like Starlink would satisfy our need to have resiliency and not lose our space capabilities. Launch is clearly another one. Mentioned launch, and again, I was a skeptic that we would ever have launch our boosters, our lower stages, actually return to the launch pad. But seeing is believing. I've seen the videos, and we've been able to return those boosters back and then reuse them weeks later. And some of them have been gone up on multiple missions. And I say that you know, the space shuttle, the Space Transportation System, the STS, again commonly known as the space shuttle, you know, that had some reusability, but not really, because those boosters would splash down in the ocean, get completely corroded, have to get towed back, and maybe years later they might be reused again. So again, it's the commercial industry that really had those breakthroughs, and we are absolutely leveraging them.
Thank you. Another question from the chat room. Hope I'm reading this correctly. Do all of the air component commanders have a director of space forces?
So the component major commands are CMAGCOMs. So PACAF and its European equivalent, USAFE. Yeah, they all have directors of space forces. PACAF and USAFE, for example, have colonels, 06s like myself. Southern Command and Northern Command, or other geographic combatant commanders might have 05s as directors of space forces. But yes, right now we are all under that legacy construct under the air component.
Thank you. Another question from the chat room. Is the Space Force responsible for defense against ICBMs?
So partly, you know, there's a missile defense agency, and the Army is more aligned to missile defense, but you can't shoot down what you can't see. So missile warning is primarily via Space Force assets. So the infrared signature of the heat coming off of a missile launch, our space assets, our sensors pick that up. They are they're basically also picked up and checked against ground-based radars, oftentimes operated by the Army. And then the actual interceptors that should it be heading to our way to harm our personnel, those interceptors are operated by the Army as well. So basically a team effort.
Gotcha. All right, here's a long one for you. The Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed the Star Wars program, was proposed missile defense system intended to protect the United States from attack by former President Ronald Reagan in 1983. Was this considered the unofficial start of Space Force? And if so, why did it take almost 40 years to make the official branch to manage it?
Well, why it took so long is a good question, and I would argue that SDI was probably getting us there, and maybe if Star Wars or SDI actually came to fruition, maybe it would have been a good impetus to have a Space Force. Another one was the 2001 Space Commission. Sometimes it was led by Donald Rumsfeld, and they recommended establishing a separate service. And they mentioned, kind of appropriate for us, that they wanted they could see in the horizon that our potential adversaries were developing capabilities, and that committee saw and warned that there could be a Pearl Harbor in space, where our space assets are being taken out, and we don't know it ahead of time, we don't have warning, and there's nothing we can do about it. So at least as far as I'm tracking during my military career, the closest we came originally was 2000, 2001 or so. But the events of September 11th kind of put us on a different track about countering global terrorism instead. And it took this long to get back to it. But you know, our competitors have kept at it. So in 2007, you know, I mentioned Russia earlier, less than a year ago, or earlier this fall, taking out one of their satellites in an anti-satellite test. But China in 2007 did the same thing, and it was a big wake-up call to us that we needed to get moving.
Very interesting. Here's another one. Is there an expected deployment plan for when those in Space Force will need to spend time in space, or if we ever colonize the moon or Mars?
Yeah, so not deployment plans right now. Could definitely be in our future. We do have a one-off Space Force astronaut, Nick Hogue, who he was already in the Air Force. He was already basically a test flight engineer or test pilot. You know, an engineer type. He transferred over, but that's a one-off. You know, the astronaut program has historically come from, you know, the astronauts have come from all services. I think that will continue, but I'd like to have it, maybe a start is have it primarily be Guardians, with that space mindedness that we're trying to develop. And then, you know, I think we're starting in different aspects. So I mentioned the astronaut program, but the other thing is, you know, non-traditional orbits. You know, I mentioned geosynchronous orbits and the low Earth orbits. That's kind of the starting point, but there are orbits at gravity wells between the Earth and the Moon. Those somebody could put a satellite in, and we need to maintain awareness of that, and maybe we want our own satellite there. The Moon, there's an outer space treaty, so the Moon is supposed to be for peaceful purposes for all of Earth, but you know, somebody might have to be able to monitor and maybe ultimately enforce that in our future. So a little bit of science fiction right now, but you could easily see us heading that way.
Thank you. Here's a comment from one of our guests. You mentioned that many support functions are still done by USAF. Is research among them? I just read that the U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory's Space Vehicles Directorate has opened a new $7.33 billion facility that will house the development of satellite technologies. Or does the AFRL support both USAF and USSF?
Yeah, very good. So that's an example. So their mantra that they adopted is one lab, two services. So AFRL, you mentioned, the directorate that's mainly out there at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, but there's also a big AFRL presence on Maui as far as research and development with respect to optical sensors, telescopes that allow us to keep track of things that are on orbit. So Air Force in name, but kind of like the Department of the Air Force or DAF acronym. When you see AFRL, you should think both Air and Space Forces.
Got it. Thank you. You mentioned
and I'll point out the Air Force Academy hasn't changed its name either. We're not going to have our own Space Force Academy anytime real soon. But when you see Air Force Academy, it's really the Air and Space Force Academy. Hopefully we'll change the name.
Thank you. You mentioned the establishment of a Space Component Command at US Indo-PACOM. How independent of the AOC do you believe that command will be? Will you have separate planning, targeting, intelligence, and other support staff? Yeah, so we're definitely working on that now, but from my observations, and I get to influence this, the AOC is kind of the best athlete for multi-domain, multi-service integration. So another example of people see the air in the Air Operations Center and they only think it's about flying. But if you've actually been there, you see that that's not the case. And one of the things that we need to work out is when we establish U.S. Space Forces Indo-Pacific is what would our service liaison element. So the Navy has a liaison element called the NAIL, but the Marines, the Marley, Army has the Battlefield Coordination Detachment, and even Special Ops has the SOL as their liaison elements within the AOC. So those and all the connectivity, all the communications, all the visualizations that are available in the AOC really make it fairly indispensable right now. So we'll continue to have dependencies. And right now, and you can think about it on holidays and early in the morning, we've got a group of guardians that perform a 24/7, 365-day mission in the AOC, doing missile warning and missile warning dissemination. So they'll see that on their displays, and they'll use their radios to get the word out to the people that are in harm's way. And right now, we don't have any plans to move them out. We're just going to use that equipment that they have right now. Thank you. Next question, was the resemblance of the U.S. Space Force's logo to Starfleet intentional?
I don't think it was necessarily intentional because it also resembles the Air Force Space Command logo before that. So I'm not sure who came first, but I don't know. It is it's kind of cool. Most people are either Star Trek or Star Wars fans, and we'll debate which one's better. We did have a little chuckle because William Shatner actually weighed in with respect to our ranks. He really wanted us to adopt Navy ranks, but we stuck with the Army and the Air Force.
Thank you for that. Next question, how will Space Force recruiting and basic be? Will Space Force just pull down from the Air Force or have their own standalone?
Yeah, that's a good question. It kind of relates to us being small and having dependencies on the Air Force. So recruiting right now, if somebody was interested in Space Force, we don't have necessarily our own recruiter. You go to the Department of the Air Force recruiter. So you go to the Air Force recruiter, and haven't tested it, but hopefully there's some training programs out there for the recruiting force, so that if they don't have that Space Force information, they can refer you to someone that does. But right now it's go to the Air Force recruiter. And you talked about basic training. So in the news recently, we've stood up our first all Space Force basic training flights there at Lackland Air Force Base, so that I think basically we get in there and basically start establishing our force's culture on new recruits as soon as we can.
Thank you. Next question. So has Space Force taken over NORAD? Hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, so NORAD is NORAD, NORTHCOM. I kind of lump them together. They're responsible for defense of the homeland. So Space Force hasn't taken it over. It's an organization that has all members, military members within it. Obviously, Canada's part of that as well. But they have dependencies on Space Force and our ability to warn of anything that's going to harm or put our homeland in harm's way, and that's how that goes. We're not taking it over.
Thank you. Another question. Are there any other known countries that have an equivalent to our Space Force?
Yeah, so not quite as a separate service, but definitely Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom all have their own space professionals. They might be with, under their Air Force, but they also have their own space operations centers and our U.S. space operations centers. We have 2 U.S. space operations centers, one at Schriever Air Force Base, Space Force Base in Colorado, and one at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. And they are all communicating and sharing capability, and they have liaison officers and all the connectivity that they need to work together. Australia has invested in U.S. Australia satellite communications programs, so we've been partners from the get-go in some of those. And then not too far behind, Japan has established their own space operations squadron, their own space operations group, and will have their own operations center as well. So I look forward out in Indo-PACOM to working with them. And one of the things they're bringing, like other partners, is they're bringing capability that we could all use, and also adds to that resiliency. There's a lot of power in a coalition. We see that in current events today. So it's not just taking on the U.S. You're taking on the U.S. and partners as well. So I think that's that's one of the things. The value of coalition partnerships is every chain of command that intersects with me values those partnerships, and I look forward to doing what I can with any partner out here in Indo-PACOM. Obviously, I mentioned Australia and Japan, but there's lots of countries that are kind of knocking on our door and want to know more about space. They want to know how they can leverage space for their country's economic benefits and the defense of their countries as well.
Thank you. One more question. What is the size of Space Force compared to the other U.S. military branches?
Yeah, I'll start with the Marines that everyone typically associates with as the smallest service, but Marines being over 180,000 strong, and then Space Force Guardians, active duty plus the civilians, are 16,000 strong. So that makes us less than 1/10 of the size of the Marines. And then even the Coast Guard has about 50,000. So we're less than half the size of the Coast Guard.
Well, thank you. I don't see any other questions that are coming through at this time. We wanted to just sincerely thank you for your time today, Colonel Zilinsky. It's been amazing to have you with us and learn a little bit more about the Space Forces program.
Well, I appreciate all those great questions. So some folks are curious and also well informed in some cases. So hopefully I was able to help. And really, it's my pleasure to help take care of this. The Missouri Memorial Association and its members, and it's really been a pleasure. So thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. And we ask all of you to stay in touch with us. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. We'll have more of these events coming up in the future. And just a shout out to our good friends, the Old Salt Coffee Company. If anyone needs a refill, please check out their website. Every dollar of the Battleship Blend helps to support the USS Missouri Memorial Association, as well as the USS New Jersey. So we thank you all for joining us today and encourage you to come back for our next one. Thank you again to Colonel Zilinsky for your time. We appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacqueline.